Hi, everybody. My name is Bobbie Wood, and I'm here with Katie Szymanski. We're from UX Content Collective, and we would like to introduce you to the Gender Inclusive Language Project. We'll be presenting the English version, talking about how we use gendered language in English and how we correct for gendered language in English. So a little bit about me. I am the founder of and the CEO of UX Content Collective. I was a former UX lead at Google and Intuit, and I've worked at several startups. So that's a little about my background.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Katie here. I work really closely with Bobbie to support UX Content Collective initiatives, including webinars, writing the dash, which you may read, and launching new courses. But I'm super excited about this project because not only, what it means for conversation design and content design, but also what it means for our everyday lives. So this is a really exciting project, and we're glad to have you here with us.
So let's talk a little bit about the goal of the project. You may have seen the overview video, but if you didn't, we'll let you know that our goal is to introduce a global awareness of gendered language. So English is not a very gendered language. It's pretty neutral for the most part. We're lacking neutral pronouns, but other than that, we don't have gendered verbs or gendered adjectives or gendered verbs like a lot of languages do. So we've got it a little bit easier in general. But the idea behind the project is to raise awareness for languages that are very gendered and to talk through some solutions about how we can be more inclusive. Our goal is to make sure that non-binary people and women, females, children, all feel included when we're talking about when you're a user of a product or you're a user of a website. We want to make sure that we're including you and that we're addressing you. And that means everyone. So that means women, men, non-binary people. We want to include everybody. And our goal is to actively work on changing that across the globe.
Awesome. So we wanted to kick it off with this quote from Kinneret, who helped start this project with us. And we think it sums it up really nicely. So writers shape language, language shapes reality. We can shape reality through our content. So key to that conversation and to evolving language are content designers and the folks who use words to create design and shape meaning and experiences. So it's the intersection of, language, design, and how we can be more inclusive throughout all of our experiences. And before we talk a little bit more about writing inclusively, we wanted to kick things off with a definition, just to kind of set the stage. So gender refers to the characteristics of women, men, girls and boys, people that are socially constructed. So norms, behaviors, roles, and what it means to be masculine, what it means to be feminine, and these social constructs that we, grow up with, that surround us, and it varies from society to society, and it can change over time. And so why gender inclusivity? Why does it matter? So this little quote describes how using gender inclusive language does not perpetuate gender stereotypes. So we're speaking in a way or writing in a way that does not discriminate or make assumptions about someone based on their sex, their gender, or their identity, which is very important when we're thinking about, creating content for every user, for all users, and being inclusive to their unique experiences. And so what are the specific issues that you see in your language now? And this is a question that we'll use to guide the conversation. So gendered language contributes to the diminishing of and the treatment of women and LGBTQ plus people, not only in society, but in our workplaces. And this isn't speculation. We know this is fact, and there are several studies that show how powerful language is on perception, how you experience the world, everything from finding employment, how you're promoted, compensated, how you experience surveys. The gendered language can skew results there, and even impact your performance at work. So this has far-reaching implications beyond content design, but we can definitely start to kind of pick apart where does content play a role in this, and how can we minimize our harm through non-gendered language. And like Bobbie mentioned earlier, in English, unlike languages like Spanish or French, most nouns, adjectives, and verbs are not gender specific. But there are many instances of gendered language, which we'll get into in a minute. And there is a broad movement, mostly led by young folks, to be more conscious of the words we use, why we use them, and where we use them, in order to not only accommodate non-binary people, but just to de-emphasize gender in the conversation and be more inclusive to all. So like I just mentioned, we don't necessarily have, masculine or feminine nouns or ways of describing words, but there is a subtle subconscious gender bias in English that is very present and very real, and in every language, which we'll see. But if we just take a second to look at the dichotomy or the difference between words that have masculine associations versus words that have feminine associations. So I don't know if you've seen a dog before, you might think, oh, what a good boy, like such a good boy. And with cats, we've seen there's a correlation between cats as being seen as more feminine, they're dainty, they're feminine. But this is just, an association that we make with the word based on our conceived notion of gender. Same thing with words like doctor and nurse, tree and flower. We don't use gendered nouns like other languages, but we have implicit bias. And so we can start to pick apart how certain words are associated with certain gender roles. And before we get into solving for this, we can start to take a look at English grammar and where gender does present itself. And so here's just an example of personal pronouns. These are the most common pronouns taught in education. So we see I, me, my, that's how I would refer to myself. You, your, yours, he, him, his, or she, her, hers. So these are typically what are used as singular pronouns. And then as you can see in plural, we have we, us, ours, you, your, yours, and they, them, theirs. And so grammatically, they has typically been used to describe a group of people, but more and more people today are embracing they as a singular pronoun when gender is either unknown, unspecified, or preferred. And so we'll get into how that's used, why that's used, and why it's important to evolve the use of pronouns to be more inclusive. So when readers see a gendered pronoun, they make assumptions about that person being described. And so the American Psychological Association advocates for singular they because it is inclusive of all people and prevents us from making assumptions. And so while all this is to be true, the use of singular they is currently debated in the US and in other English-speaking countries. So here are just a few headline examples. Up in arms over a pronoun, the pronoun punch, why hostility against gender-neutral identity, a very scary thing to tell someone, the debate over gender pronouns in schools. And so you can see that there's divisiveness, right, around the idea of using your preferred pronouns. And this isn't anything new. So if we just take a look at use of singular they has actually been baked in and used across some of our favorite books, Jane Austen, William Shakespeare, Lewis Carroll, F. Scott Fitzgerald, all of this literature that's taught in schools dates back to the 14th century, have used singular they to talk about a person when gender isn't known or when it's preferred. And so again, this isn't anything new, but adopting it and using it in today's world and in our workplace is definitely something that is contentious, but important to talk about, and it's evolving. So that's just a little bit of context in terms of how they, them has been received and is continuing to be adopted. And so the next kind of section will look at how people on content teams are working to address gendered language, and also how individuals like ourselves can use it in our everyday speech and writing. So similar to how we took a look at how they, them is used in the plural sense, this is a quick example of using they to talk about a singular person. So Casey is a gender fluid person. They are from Texas and enjoy tacos. Casey, they. Every client got a care package delivered to them. We're not saying to him or her, we're saying to them. Each child played with their parent. The cup of coffee is theirs. A private person usually keeps to themselves. So again, we're modifying. We're not saying a private person keeps to himself or herself. We're saying themselves. We remove that binary. We make the phrase much more inclusive. And so just thinking about how we can make additional modifications in our speech or in our writing. Earlier, we talked about, gender bias and the implicit gender bias in words in our language. We could also think about gender roles and how that shows itself in how we talk about professions, how we talk about relationships to other people. So these are just a few examples that we found that kind of illustrate how you can make a phrase much more inclusive. So instead of saying freshman, you could say first year student. Boyfriend or girlfriend, you could say partner. Waiter or waitress, server. Ladies or gentlemen, folks, or everybody. So there's a whole list that if you Google how to replace gendered nouns for roles, you can see very subtle difference in how we're saying these things, but we're taking away that that gender stereotype, right? And we're making it more accessible and friendly for all. So this is just a subtle way that you can change your language, modify slightly, but really have a big impact in how you're making people feel welcome. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Bobbie, who's going to take us through some content and tech instances, ways that we can make our content and our experiences more gender inclusive.
So as a content designer, you guys are going to be mostly focused on how to write differently for UI, for user interfaces. And we have a great example here where in Slack, they have a built-in Slack bot that reminds people to use gender inclusive language over gendered language. So just make sure that when you're talking to your whole team that you're not saying him as the default. And instead you're saying them or they or their. Another tool you can use is just to take away his or her and replace with a neutral article like the or a. So instead of a doctor takes his job seriously, we can just say a good doctor takes the job seriously. And there are lots of places when, as UX writers, we're used to examining our writing closely. This is another call out to make sure that we're keeping our eyes on those pronouns that we're using. A really, really awesome evolution that companies have taken on is to actually create and share new guidelines. And we're seeing a lot of companies embrace this and share it publicly. And that's really been encouraging, I think, for a lot of people to just feel comfortable about embracing gender neutral language and pronouns. So here we have an example from Adobe. The Adobe Spectrum design guidance actually says to use they, them instead of he, she. So we just want to make sure that we're acknowledging that a lot of very large tech companies and companies across the globe are really looking to make this update because we want to respect all users of all kinds, regardless of gender. When we look at a company like Intuit, they have put right into their design guidance to make it a very clear writing goal to be gender inclusive. And this is important. Katie talked about a few examples, like an accountant, assuming an accountant is always male, or assuming a tax expert is male. So instead, what we want to do is we want to make it a clear goal to understand that any gender could be an accountant. A non-binary person could be an accountant. And we want to respect that and make sure that we call it out, acknowledge that, and respect those people in whatever role they're in. So as a content designer, you can be a person who ongoing reminds your team to look for opportunities to be gender neutral and inclusive. And we see this example from the Google developer guidance as well. Just making sure that we're conscientious. Instead of saying 16 man hours, we can just say 16 work hours, 16 person hours, however we rephrase that to remove the word man. So just always be looking for those opportunities to sort of update the language that your coworkers use and to make sure that we're being respectful for customers when we're speaking directly to them. Another opportunity beyond the they, them singular pronoun, there's been innovation with language, and we see a new pronoun used occasionally, which is HIR here, which is often used for non-binary people instead of him or her. In this case, we're shown an example that uses MX, and this is from Merriam-Webster, so this is official. You can use MX as a title if people prefer not to be referred to as Mr. or Ms. So a couple decades ago, we got Ms., which was better than Mrs. or Miss, which made someone's marital status known. So now we can even move farther away from that, and we can even leave gender out of the picture so that we end up with very neutral titles for people. We can also look at a couple more examples, and these are awesome. Even whitehouse.gov has an option when you select a pronoun for they, them, which is fantastic. There's an option that we don't necessarily approve of all that much, which is an other category. So we would discourage people from using a term like other, because that literally makes it seem like, what, are you not human anymore? Like you've gone out of the realm of even being a person. We don't want that. So you can see on the right, there's another example where there's a long list of gender types to choose from. So there's intersex and there's transgender and there's let me type my own, along with traditional male or female or non-binary. And so this is really the best way to do it. Let people choose to express their gender identity in the way that they're comfortable with.
Yeah, and Bobbie, just to add to that, I really like this example with option G. I prefer not to say, because I think exactly that, let people choose to, express their gender. And if you prefer not to reveal that data, like that's also a really smart option. So I just thought that was a great way to include that.
Yeah, agree. And then on your teams, make sure that you may not have a huge customer contingency knocking down your door asking for us to add inclusive features to our software. But especially when you're working on any product that uses a lot of profile data or includes a lot of identity information, make sure that you're pushing your team to account for all of those gender inclusive pronouns and identities, so that your whole user base feels comfortable and feels accepted and welcome in your user experience. So just make sure that you're looking out for that, and that we push for it internally to change the game and help all of our users feel included. In an area of new tech, we see things like voice tech, where we had Siri, who's a woman, and the default Google Home voice was a woman's voice. And there were some articles that came out that said, well, naturally, those people sound more subservient, which of course, a lot of women didn't think was so great. And so we've seen a movement away from always having voice tech, for example, use a female voice. So we want to make sure that when we are building new features again that are innovative, that we're always engaging with this idea of gender neutrality and that we're pushing for it because it's sort of what's more comfortable and fair for our non-binary users and for a lot of people who just don't want to be identified by their gender. So we see Google Docs has, and their AI is now trained to suggest gender neutral terms. Right on, that makes it easy. Thanks, Google Docs. And we saw the example earlier about Slack suggesting that we avoid gender neutral language. So these are great ways that using new innovative technology can also help us to avoid being exclusive or sounding like we're not being inclusive enough with gender identity.
Yeah, thank you, Bobbie, for taking us through that. And we thought we would just end with a quote from Dr. Grace Hopper, who is a computer scientist and in the US Navy. So the most dangerous phrase in the English language is "we have always done it this way," which we think kind of encapsulates the whole project, right? Like language does feel like this big daunting thing that's set in stone and you know we can't make modifications, but as we just looked at all those examples, we are making new ways for us to use language, use the tools that we have, use language as a tool to be more inclusive. So the whole point of this is to keep the conversation going and to get more people involved in how we make our writing, make our language, make languages worldwide more inclusive. So we just wanted to take this back to you and have you reflect on how you will use gender neutral language in your daily life, at work. And we hope that you found some useful insights here and ways that you can get involved. But we'll also share links to all the resources, transcripts, and all the other videos on our website so that you can take a look. And we will have more ways for you to get involved there as well. So thank you, everyone, for taking the time. If you made it this far.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us. Be sure to watch more videos.